forget. Now, some people will seize today for their own pleasure. Knowing that they will die, they will go to Vegas or some other pleasurable excursion that was on their bucket list. But perhaps we should instead use our last moments serving God, knowing that we would be facing that God shortly for judgment. This seems to have been the approach of Mother Carini, a role model for us who live in the shadow of Chicago. Alleluia, 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 alleluia. Whoever loves me will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to the apostles, "Who among you would say to your servant, who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here immediately and take your place at table'? Would he not rather say to him, 'Prepare something for me to eat. Put on your apron and wait on me while I eat and drink. You may eat and drink when I'm finished.' Is he grateful to that servant because he did what was commanded? So it should be with you. When you have done all you have been commanded."
To you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In many of my homilies, especially on this day, as we cover today's saint, St. Josaphat, who's held up as the patron saint of church unity, you've heard me say, well, there was just one church for the first 1,000 years, and then we ended up being divided into thousands of pieces. Now, being you're a more smarter group, you few who come to daily Mass, and let's just take it a little bit further. I feel like I owe you a little bit of honesty here. If we really took a serious look at church history, division and disunity has been a part of the story of the Christian church from day one. And the first real big division you can trace back to the time of the Acts of the Apostles. If you remember, there was a division over whether you had to become Jewish first by following all the dietary laws and being circumcised. In other words, you had to be Jewish first before you could become Christian. And then you had St. Paul on the other side of the great argument and says, no, that's all in the past. You don't have to be circumcised anymore. You can eat pork as much as you like. And you had that division, and it was settled, usually, and this is the story of the church too, there's some sort of division, and it's usually settled by some sort of council. And there's a meeting of the minds, and there's agreement. With that particular thing that I mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, it was the Council of Jerusalem. And for that reason, Christians are not required to be circumcised or follow all the dietary laws, etc. But here's another aspect of that, and you see this also in the Acts of the Apostles, that even though there's a decision, like, okay, this is the direction we're going to go, you always have those groups that don't go along with it, that reject it. And you see that, I bring that up because you see that in the Acts of the Apostles, and you see that throughout the history of the church. There's some sort of disagreement. And so there is a council that is called. There's an agreement over what's the right thing, the quote-unquote orthodox teaching. The word orthodox means the right teaching on the matter. But even though you have that decision, you have various people who say, no, we're not going to go along with it. So this is part of the narrative of the history of the church that I don't like sharing with you, because I want to paint, well, it's always been one holy Catholic Apostolic Church until the Protestants came along. No, I think that's not accurate. I think if you really look, there's always been those splinter groups. Now, I think if you look at these splinter groups, some of them have survived, but they're usually small. They're usually localized in a country. They never take on the mainstream of thought. Some of these groups, like for instance, the Arianism. The Arians, who even though Arianism was condemned by the Council of Nicaea, the truth be known, it survived 300, 400 years. But you don't see the first church of the first church of the Arians in Cordova or Rapid City or even in the Quad Cities. You don't see that. They disappeared, right? Even though they were a big group at the time. So, all right up front, let's be honest here. You've always had splinter groups. Some of them have survived over the course of history, but most of them disappeared. Now, having said that, I think it is accurate to say that there has always been one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. You always had kind of the mainstream that accepted whatever the Ecumenical Council taught as the right or orthodox teaching. And very early on, matter of fact, you see this term tracing back to I want to say 100 AD, this mainstream of believers who accepted the teachings of the various patriarchs who were in union with the Bishop of Rome, that they accepted the quote-unquote orthodox teaching, whatever it was, the right teaching. The term that was used for this mainstream group was called Catholic. That these were the Catholic Christians. In other words, the word Catholic is a Greek term which means universal, whole. They're the ones who accepted the whole of the truth of the teaching as the church understands it versus these various splinter groups who rejected some element of the whole teaching. So I think it would be more accurate to say, I know you two girls are going we just want to go home and eat breakfast, right? All right, I understand. But I think it is more accurate to say that for the first 1,000 years, there was one Catholic church, in other words, mainstream church, that accepted the teaching of these various ecumenical councils. In other words, it was the Catholic Church who accepted Orthodox teaching. But pretty much that came to an end around 1200 AD. Around 1200 AD, there was a split. And, you always had those splinter groups, but this is like the first huge split. And it was a split, not like this little group here following this one priest. It was a split between the 5 major patriarchs of the world. Up to this point, when there was an ecumenical council, all the major patriarchs, they were on board. And they were all on the same page as the Bishop of Rome. It was very important that they'd all be on the same page. When I talk about the major patriarchs, I'm talking about Constantinople, which is considered New Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and of course Rome itself. I think I'm missing one there. Oh, Jerusalem, of course. But Jerusalem, believe it or not, Jerusalem wasn't a major player by this time in the history of the church. So, around 1200 AD, there was a huge split, which was kind of the beginning of the end of church unity as we know it. The Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope of Rome, and the Pope of Rome excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and you had a split. And so the Church of the West that followed the Pope of Rome, they started calling themselves Catholic. And the other 5 patriarchs, namely Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, they start calling themselves Orthodox. So that's why you have the Eastern churches that are not in Rome. They call themselves Orthodox because they have the right teaching versus the Roman church that has embraced heresy. Where we of the Roman church, we call ourselves Catholic because we have the fullness of church unity under the head of the church, the Pope, who is the vicar of Christ, the successor of St. Peter, where these other four, they're all in schism. They have broken off. They have destroyed the true unity of the church. Now, over the centuries, there have been many efforts to try to bring the unity back between these five historical capitals of Christianity. But, there would be agreement here. There was at one point actually an agreement. There was unity, but the people back home, they didn't accept it. Now, how does today's saint fit all into this? Well, in 1595, there was a major attempt on the part of a few Orthodox bishops. When today's saint was a boy, the Orthodox bishop of Belarus and 5 other bishops representing millions of Ruthenians, those people who live mostly in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, they sought reunion with Rome. And today's saint, St. Josaphat, would continue their work, and he would end up dying for their work. St. Josaphat was born of Orthodox parents, and he embraced the Catholic faith, and he became a Basilian monk in Lithuania. He became bishop in what is now part of Russia at a relatively young age, and he faced a difficult situation. Most monks, fearing interference in liturgy and customs, did not want union with Rome. By synods, catechetical instruction, the reform of the clergy, and his personal example, St. Josaphat was successful in winning the greater part of the Orthodox in his area to this union. But the next year, a dissident hierarchy was set up, and his opposition spread, accusing St. Josaphat of, quote-unquote, going Latin. There's kind of a twofold reason why the Orthodox are leery of union with Rome. Part of it is there's some doctrinal issues, but if the truth be known, there's always been that issue that they'll become Romanized. They have their own liturgical traditions. And there's been this problem of once they end up being in union with Rome, they'll be forced to take on the Roman traditions, and they lose their own identity. So that was a problem. And so, St. Josaphat was accused of going Latin. That's what that meant, being forced to be Romanize the liturgy, and that all of his people would have to do the same. Despite warnings, he went to the hotbed of trouble. Attempts were made to drive him from his own diocese. A priest was sent to shout insults at him from the courtyard of his own house. When St. Josaphat had him removed and shut up in his house, the opposition rang the town bell and a mob assembled. The priest was released from the house, but members of the mob broke into the bishop's home, and St. Josaphat was struck with an axe, then shot, as if, having an axe, being hit by an axe wasn't enough. He was shot, and at insult upon injury, his body was thrown into the river. It was later recovered and is now buried at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He was the first saint of the Eastern Church to be canonized by Rome. And he's the only Eastern saint that is buried in a Western Roman church, St. Peter's. Now, the reason why I know so much about St. Josaphat is that on one of my trips to Rome, matter of fact, my first trip to Rome, I had the opportunity of celebrating Mass on his tomb. In St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, there are many side altars, and if you got up early, when they opened up the gates, you would be taken to a sacristy, and then they would assign you an altar to offer a private mass. So I did that a few times. The first time I did this, the Italian altar server, little boy, he led me out to a side altar, and what was it? It was St. Josaphat. So I literally offered mass on the tomb of St. Josaphat. The altar was on top, and you'd have like a glass window underneath where you could see the body of St. Josaphat. And just by chance, my second trip to St. Peter's, I was there, and it just so happened to be on this day. It was November 12th. I was in Rome. And on that day, they have a special Eastern liturgy. They bring in people from the Eastern Rite, and they offer this Mass on the tomb of St. Josaphat. In 1967, when newspaper photos showed St. Pope Paul VI embracing the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, it marked a significant step toward healing a division in Christendom that had spanned more than 9 centuries. Since then, the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople have made efforts to strengthen the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. You know, and of course, as many of you know, the Patriarch of Constantinople actually came, which was a historic first, for the installation of Pope Francis. And even though I know that a major, how should I say, the dividing issue within the Roman Church is Pope Francis's, agenda of the whole climate change and of the care of the environment. Ironically enough, even though it causes division amongst us Roman Catholics, that's one of the things that the Orthodox Church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Pope of Rome, they're actually working together on in terms of a joint agenda in terms of worrying about the environment. Much has been accomplished in the last 50 years, but the work of St. Josaphat has yet to be completed. Alleluia, 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 alleluia. Shine like lights in the world as you hold on to the word of life. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to his disciples, "Things that cause sin will inevitably occur, but woe to the one through whom they occur. It would be better for him if a millstone were put around his neck and he be thrown into the sea than for him to cause one of these little ones to sin. Be on guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him, and if he repents, forgive him. And if he wrongs you 7 times in one day and returns to you 7 times saying, 'I am sorry,' you should forgive him." And the apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
In previous years, matter of fact, year after year, I have told you the famous story, the legend about today's saint, St. Martin of Tours, that he was a soldier in the Roman army, actually a member of the cavalry, to be exact, how he used his military cloak and he cut it in 2 to give half of his cloak to the beggar clad only in rags in the depths of winter. And I told you how Jesus appeared later in a dream to him, wearing the half of the cloak of the beggar. And after that experience, he resigned his commission and was baptized a Christian. And Then he became a monk, and then eventually became the Bishop of Tours, which is in now modern-day France. Being he was a veteran, and today is officially Veterans Day in our country, St. Martin has become the patron saint of veterans. Although there are those who claim that it would be more accurate to say that he is the patron saint of conscientious objectors. Because once he had this experience and he was baptized, he refused to kill. But the army wasn't about to let him go. It wasn't like, okay guys, I'm done. No, you were conscripted for life. And he was facing the firing squad. I mean, he was going to be executed over this because he refused to fight anymore. But instead, and I think there's a whole long story about this, I think partially because he came from a prominent family, part of it was they could see that he was sincere in terms of wanting to be a Christian and embrace the life of a monk. They instead of executing him, they decided to release him from his responsibilities, and then we could say the rest is history. Veterans are not the only ones who claim St. Martin of Tours as his patron. He is also the patron saint of alcoholics, which seems rather appropriate. I mean, we know that the veterans are the ones who see the horrors of war, the battle, and then they have to come back and live the rest of their lives. And I don't think I'm telling you anything that, at least the two of you that are veterans, we know that alcoholism, drug addiction, all the traumas, with the PTSD, all that stuff, that's part and parcel of the things that veterans deal with, although, of course, they're not the only ones. But there's another reason why St. Martin of Tours is also the patron saint of alcoholics. For the Romans, November 11th was originally Vinalia, which was the feast of Bacchus. Bacchus was the god of wine and good times. So today, for the Romans, this was one big party, very much a lot of drunkenness. By the way, how many of you know Linda Olson? Do any of you? You do, okay. You know her house up on the hill? She has a big statue of Bacchus on the front yard. I think he's holding a huge vat of wine. So if you want to see a depiction of Bacchus, just go to Linda's house. But in order to counteract this, they declared that today, instead of it being the feast in honor of St. Bacchus, that it would become the feast of St. Martin of Tours. And because of that, he became the patron saint of those who deal with problems with drinking. But also, on the other hand, he was also employed as the patron saint of those who own vineyards and those who produce the product. While those who had a problem with drinking were recommended to invoke him to save them from sin, the vineyards and those who produced the product, well, they invoked him in order that they might have a product to sell. The Holy Spirit of discipline flees deceit and withdraws from senseless counsels. That's a line from today's first reading. It's from the Book of Wisdom. St. Martin worked tirelessly not only to convert the pagan countryside, but also to fight the heresy of Arianism, which was an insidious and widespread heresy in the 4th century. And just to refresh your memory, the Council of Nicaea was called in order to fight against it. Arius was a priest who basically said that Jesus, he was the perfect man, and he was definitely an adopted son of God, you could say, but he wasn't really one with the Father and Holy Spirit. In other words, he was just a glorified human being. And so the Council of Nicaea was called to say, no, he was actually one. Even though he is fully human, he's fully God. God from God, light from light, true light from true light. Begotten, but not made. You know, that was all spelled out, but if the truth be known, as you all know, Rome or a council could condemn something, but it takes maybe 340, 400 years after that. The the residue of these heresies, they just hold on forever, don't they? And so St. Martin of Tours, he had to fight this even in the frontiers. What was the frontiers of the Roman Empire, which was France. And, you know, if you know anything about Arianism, it wasn't the poor, it wasn't the common folk that were infected with it. It was the rich. It was the powerful. Mostly it was the intellectuals. The irony is that most of the common folk, they held on to